This sitting is resumed. Senator Walcott, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. As I rise to speak briefly this afternoon on the Appropriation Bill 2018, recognizing that it comes 2 weeks before Parliament is dissolved, and certainly for several of us, honorable senators, probably the last time they will be speaking in an appropriation debate. But in doing so, I must reflect on the state of affairs in my country, Barbados, over the last 10 years of Democratic Labour Party mismanagement and misrule, which has caused misery to thousands of Barbadians across this country. Indeed, Madam President, I should probably say it has caused a bit of delusion after listening to the speech of the leader of government business this morning. Not only misery, but certainly some creation of delusional states. Madam President, mismanagement that has resulted in uncollected garbage all over this country. Mismanagement in that respect in terms of the numbers of garbage trucks available to collect garbage in Barbados. Issues as simple as in terms of regulating the tipping fees, so that introducing tipping fees, you don't put the regulations and the monitoring in place, so that at the end of the day, you now have the indiscriminate dumping of garbage in our gullies. Mismanagement, Madam President, in terms of the situation on the South Coast, with the overflowing of sewage in the streets, and the obvious dithering of the powers that be in terms of handling that crisis. Over 100 days it's been ongoing, and the people of Barbados are yet to hear the definitive and specific position and recommendations in terms of dealing with that crisis. The roads, Madam President, in a deplorable condition, so much so that one of their own, an honorable cabinet minister, spoke publicly about the condition of the dire need for something to be done to address the situation in terms of our roads. Madam President, mismanagement that results in thousands and hundreds of Barbadians evenings, many of them women and children trying to get home because of the lack of buses and the unavailability of buses. Mismanagement. And I heard the honorable member speaking about the QEH in terms of breastfeeding reaccreditation that has been present at the QEH from the time I was an intern, I believe. But mismanagement in terms of the time it takes for people to obtain adequate health care at the Accident and Emergency Department after 10 years of promises that this would improve. And I gave the government something, because about 4 years ago, there was a lot of sound and fury about how the waiting times had been reduced 4 years ago, had been reduced in casualty to between 4 and 6 hours. Madam President, I wouldn't like to think what it is now, where any day you can go to A&E and see people waiting in trolleys and waiting in cubicles, waiting to be admitted for days, and sometimes people outside saying that they've been there since the day before. That obtains now 10 years after the Democratic Labour Party took over the reins and was supposed to improve these matters. Madam President, mismanagement for old age pensioners who oftentimes go to the polyclinics and get their medication is not available, or indeed, if they require a month's supply, sometimes only 2 months' supply is available. Yes, the drug service has reduced its expenditure, but so in terms of the volumes of medication to be dispensed at the polyclinics, they can't keep track, and usually there are shortages. As a result, of course, many people are unable to comply with the doctor's request in terms of control of the hypertension and the diabetes because of these outages and stockouts in the public pharmacies, which are the responsibility of the government. Madam President, the mismanagement in terms of the recurring and intermittent water outages, especially in rural Barbados. In a situation where government finds it reasonable to build a new headquarters rather than focusing on the need to provide potable water to all citizens of this country who deserve. And I agree with the honourable member that the water's quality is first class. I do agree with that. Madam President, mismanagement in terms of an apparent inability to manage the increasing adolescent violence in schools these days. And it is something that we all need to pay attention to. Mismanagement in terms of our crime situation, regrettably, Madam President. And to top all of this, mismanagement in terms of being unable to control the rising prices for basic items for the ordinary person in this society. This is the state of affairs which obtains in Barbados after 10 years of Democratic Labour Party mismanagement and misrule. And I hear that we are supposed to sit on the side and not to boo. There's no booing. This is shame. This is shameful. All of this, Madam President, has resulted across this island in a feeling of hopelessness and gloom. Barbadians from all social strata, all walks of life, all ages, all ethnic groups are obviously concerned and very concerned about what is happening in their country. As they struggle to pay their taxes, some of them wonder if they're going to lose their jobs, if taxes are going to be increased again, will they have to pay for health care at the hospital? How will they pay their bank loans? Some of them are wondering in terms of their house rent with everything that is happening. And of course, they're wondering about the devaluation of the dollar, if this will happen, and if it does happen, how will they manage? These are all of the things that are bothering ordinary Barbadians day to day in Barbados. And this is a state that obtains after 10 years of the Democratic Labour Party. But Madam President, the irony is that this is the end result of a government that promised that they, and I love this, Madam President, they would not lie, they would not cheat, they would not steal. I repeat them. They would not lie, they would not cheat, they would not steal, and that promised good governance and transparency. That's what they promised, Madam President. But certainly, there'll be a time and place, I'm sure, that all honorable members will be free to speak, free to say what they have to say. But in terms, they also promised pathways to progress. And I wonder pathways to where and progress for who, if only for a few members of the cabinet who before 2008 could not afford to pay their rents, but now live in massive houses and drive very expensive cars. But there's time for that, and of course, there was going to be good governance and transparency, and no stealing, or cheating, or lying. A government that was strident with you, that was strident. Sorry about that, Madam President. You're not supposed to hear sights. A government that was strident in 2013, saying that the economy was stable. I'm sure all of them remember it. And that it was ready for takeoff, ironically, in January 2013. They told Barbadians, they told them that the foreign reserves were rising. I wonder. They were rising. And now we are concerned about the opposite. Of course, that was just a month before the last election. But they would not lie or cheat or steal. That promise that jobs would be secure, but then sent home thousands. But then again, they would not lie. That promise that UE students would not have to pay fees by no less a person than the Prime Minister, but then introduce fees. But they would not lie. That promise in the last manifesto, continuing pathways to progress and economically viable Barbados. And FI is a document of the House, the last manifesto, and they promised socially balanced policies, I guess to do with garbage and solid waste and the school system and the health care. Economically viable development. I guess that is the economic crisis that we are facing after 10 years. Environmentally sound practices. The overflowing sewage on the south coast, the uncollected garbage, the indiscriminate dumping in gullies, good, honest governance. That speaks for itself, Madam President. And this same government promises you, the Barbadians, that the dollar will not be devalued and we will not go to the IMF while being at the doors of the IMF. And I want them to get up in here and say that that is not true. This same government now comes with a fifth plan to rescue Barbados. A Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018, on the eve of the night of the elections. One word to describe this, the government and this: pathetic. Pathetic. After 10 years, finally, I almost said, Madam President, when they're about to die, but as a medical practitioner, first, do no ill. They come with a Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan. And Madam President, the leader of government business made, I was going to say sound and dance, but she read some of the verses of some songs for us about this document and how there was cooperation and buying. And so I decided to look, and it sounded all very interesting and impressive. The private sector, social partners working with the government in the interest of the country in terms of a recovery plan. So I started to read what the representatives of the private sector entities had to say about the plan. And I started reading the comments of the statement by the private sector, Barbados Private Sector Association. And it is under the name of a Mr. Charles Herbert. The Barbados Private Sector Association believes the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018 presents an opportunity to chart the recovery of the Barbadian economy. He went on to say, while we acknowledge the broad consensus on the objectives set out in this document, we recognize that implementation plans, which are critical to the success of the objectives, are still to be developed. So we have this document, this is the answer, this is the plan. We have heard the Honorable Minister speaking about targets in April, but we heard the head of the private sector entity, who is going along with it, says that we recognize that implementation plans, which are critical to the success of the objectives, are still to be developed. So you rush in here with a plan. It's the answer to everything. And there is no way, in terms of the implementation, you have not even devised the plan, but you're telling me that you have targets to be achieved in April. But they do not lie. He went on to say, this document represents an improvement in the collaboration of the social partners, which we should strive to further develop and build on in the future. In no way does he say that this plan is one that he supports the private sector and that this is the plan to rescue Barbados. I go on to the statement by the Congress of the Trade Unions and Staff Association of Barbados, Mr. Cedric Merle. And he says in part, the Congress welcomes the proposed formation of the Special Subcommittee of the Social Partnership charged with the implementation of the initiatives contained in the plan and pledges its full participation. He says, and I believe this is the endorsement and the agreement, the Congress believes that the formulation and implementation of the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018 will strengthen the collaborative mechanism of the Barbados Social Partnership model. I repeat, he said, the Congress believes that the formulation and implementation of the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018 will strengthen the collaborative mechanisms of the Barbados Social Partnership model. Nowhere does he say in here that this is the plan or that he endorses this plan, which is supposed to be the recovery plan for Barbados' economic woes. I go to the statement by the representative of the Barbados Workers' Union. And I had to drink some water under the name of Miss Tony Moore. She says, approaches to social dialogue as witnessed during the past 5 years will not suffice. This is her endorsement. She goes on to say, it considers, the union understands that as part of its contribution to the national recovery effort, it will have to have its membership share in some moments when sacrifices may have to be made. It considers that meaningful discussions must be held where any such painful decisions will need to undergo a critical examination by all stakeholders. The union further reiterates that measures must be made to reduce the levels of hardship facing some of our citizens. The Barbados Workers' Union undertakes openly and in good faith to participate in those parts of the plan where it can render meaningful assistance. It is our hope that with the willingness we should have all to pull together, we will achieve the goals we have set ourselves. And we were told this morning that this plan put together by the social partners in collaboration with the government. And I would figure, Madam President, if it was put together like that certainly all of them would be endorsing it as a solution. There would not be this cautionary language. This, there would be unreserved support. Let us get on board, as the Honorable Leader said this morning. Let us get on board. This ship is afloat, and we, the social partners, will endorse the plan and move with it. Not a word from any one of them saying that they fully endorse it or that they expect it to do any of the things that we were told that it will do. Madam President, that a government that has broken all of these promises over the last 10 years can be trusted or believed. This is a major problem. In a situation as obtains in this country, at this point in time, in order for all hands to be there must be a measure of trust and believability. That is such a word. And I don't know that the citizens of this country naturally have that trust and belief in the government. So I don't know what is going to happen. But, Madam President, I got carried away. I needed to speak in terms of the leader of government business, who led off. And I really must go back to that at this point in time. Because, Madam President, I was certainly disappointed when I didn't hear, when I recognized that my dear friend from the other side, the leader of government business, was not going to lead off in this appropriation bill. And I certainly missed that. Over the years, I have enjoyed her presentations. She was sometimes rambling and tedious. But this today, I must tell the Honorable Leader of Government Business, she was missed dearly in terms of the presentation of this appropriation bill today. She was missed. Her presence and presentation was fairly missed. I know some of the independent senators feel the same way. They're not saying it now, but I will say it. I will say it. What was it? What were we treated to as a presentation on an appropriation bill from a serious government that is seeking a third term in office? What were we treated to? The appropriation bill. She said it was the most important bill that is ever debated in this House. She spoke about it being constitutional and it was necessary. And then we were treated to her birthday, that she will be 50, that she looks like 29, that there's a society and an economy, and it is about darning. And if, Madam President, if you could darn, and it was about darning the society and bringing people together. And then she made reference to the opposition, which is for the first time is now speaking, and about how we shout. But I wonder, in terms of criticizing Barbados, obviously she has short-term memory loss in terms of what happened in 2008. And then she read from Hebrew, and she quoted Colossians, and then she read the words of a psalm. And Madam President, I wondered where I was. I could not believe I was in this honorable chamber participating in an appropriation bill. And that is where, in spite of feeling quite ill, I decided I had to speak. I had to speak. To say the least, Madam President, it was digressive, it was tedious, it was repetitive, and when I listened to it, I said all of this could have been condensed and done convincingly in half an hour. I certainly don't plan to overstay my time this evening. Probably. But after the 2 hours, it's the same old storyline. Don't mind the naysayers. Things are fine in Barbados. Everything is improving. But nothing to specifically to tell us how we're going to deal with this critical issues facing this country. Not only in terms of the social services, but importantly in terms of the economic issues. And certainly I look forward to hearing the Shadow Minister of Finance on the other side, that is the Honorable Senator Ince, Shadow Minister of Finance, my friend, the Honorable Minister of Business, when he elucidates on the financial matters in this debate. But in terms of the appropriation bill, in terms of the figures, I mean, there were not any substantial changes in terms of the government's setting its projections, project to use to 3.2 million this year. And again, as a favorite of him, the VAT receipts are looking very good. They expect to collect another $1 million, is $1 billion anticipated this year. There's a notable increase in terms of the burdensome NSRL, which the government has introduced in terms of the people in Barbados. But there's still that deplorable situation concerning persons who are unable to get their income tax returns after several years. And I did hear the minister speaking in another place, giving the assurance that this is going to be dealt with. So I assume it will be dealt with. However, similar situation in terms of VAT returns for business houses, and I'm gathering now that these may be well over $500 million, which is still to be paid to persons in terms of their businesses, and obviously would be affecting the businesses in terms of generation. In terms of the expenditure, the usual faults and impressions, Madam President, were for budgeting measures and in terms of the balance of payment situation, the usual underestimating of the amounts that would be needed for the sanitation, the Barbados Water Authority, the National Housing Corporation, and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Worrying, however, Madam President, is the matter of the debt service expenditure, which I believe is on the table 6 is expected to be roughly $1.7 billion this year. And that is, in terms when you're speaking, that is about 53% of your revenue. And no doubt, honorable members will speak to in terms of the debt overhang and how that affects provision of services in Barbados. It is not, I believe it is no secret that in terms the governor of the central bank spoke about it in his last press conference, in terms of the, I don't want to say depletion, in terms of the foreign reserves. And in his last press release, December 2017, he said a modest growth in tourism earnings and the contraction of non-oil imports enabled the external current account deficit to stabilize. But the stock of international reserves declined further to 410 million. And this provides approximately 6.5 weeks of import cover. And his words, well below the desired benchmark of 12 weeks. I heard the honorable member who presented on government's behalf dismissing, speaking about growth, moderate growth, and sort of dismissing the issue of foreign reserves. But I think all members would recognize that this is extremely important. And on the matter of the debt overhang and the debt service, I know there was a bit of the honorable senator on the other side, my friend, always likes to take me to Appendix C in terms of the drain, in terms of the debt servicing. And they always like to speak about the prison and the loan for the prison. I believe there was a loan of 288, roughly $0.6 million in terms of the prison. And it is paid back over, finishes in 2032, according to the note. And my notes show me that in 10 years, the prison was built on the Barbados Labour Party, as it occurs in governor. The interest on the loan started being repaid in 2008. Unfortunately, that is when the Democratic Labour Party took over the reins of government. In 10 years, $44 million have been repaid. Incidentally, there was a Credit Suisse loan. On average, I said then, the prison initially was about $4 million a year, $5 million, $7 million last financial year. There's a loan for Credit Suisse loan of 225,000 US, 450 million, which I believe has to be paid in about 5 years. And I think, Madam President, I think all persons in this honorable chamber would agree that that has been burdensome in terms of the debt servicing and in terms of our foreign reserves. Because you will see that we've had to pay in the last, if I look at page, Appendix C, page 11, some $112 million were paid off on that loan. In 2007 and 2018 estimates, it was approximately $113 million that were paid.
Madam President,
Yes,
on a point of order.
point of order.
Senator Walcott is misleading. Senator Walcott is misleading this honorable chamber in stating that $44 million was repaid to the loan to the prison in the last 10 years. Madam President, as far as I am aware, the government of Barbados every January must look for $30 million to pay for that prison. And as far as I am aware, no interest rate was stated. He likes to go to Appendix C. And I would like the Honorable Senator to let this Senate know how he arrived at $44 million, Madam President, when in Appendix C, there is no interest rate attributed to that loan when you should have an interest rate. Those are the things that he needs to explain, but there's no $44 million.
Madam President, I think the honorable member is well aware that in some of these loans there is something called a bullet payment. And clearly, my interpretation of this is that that's what it said, 2032. At that point in time, it would be similar to the Japanese loan that occurred some years ago, where you were faced with a bullet payment in 2032.
Madam President, on a point of order, if I am hearing the point of order, Senator Walcott is again misleading this honorable chamber. Because if what I am hearing, based on Appendix C, that Senator Walcott is now telling this chamber and the entire Barbados, the public of Barbados, that this loan is a bullet loan, when it was never stated by the previous government that this loan is going to be paid similar to the Japanese loan, is scandalous. Madam President, it's scandalous to be saying to the people that it's going to be like a bullet loan. Madam President, that is why the interest rate, it is scandalous. And this is going to make good reading or good analysis as we go forward. Madam President.
Madam President, I don't know if the honorable member would dispute the fact that $112 million were paid in the last financial year towards the Credit Suisse loan. So he's saying that if I take it, I have always been speaking about two different loans. I was speaking about drains on, Madam President, through you, drainage on the foreign reserves. And there are two loans here which are involved fundamentally. The one to do with the prison and the Credit Suisse loan. And I simply stated, I was comparing the two. The honorable senator is saying that it's $30 million for the prison, and I am saying, okay, if you have your 30, last financial year, you paid $113 million. In this current one, in the estimate say you paid $112 million towards the Credit Suisse, a loan of $450 million that you have to pay in 5 years. And all I'm saying is that in circumstances where we are facing with a crisis in terms of our foreign reserves, this becomes painful and dangerous for us. And when I'm on my feet, before the honorable member interjects, I'm going to ask him so they can speak to it at the same time. If it is true that they already have access, the SDRs from the IMF, in terms of trying to support their foreign reserves position.
Madam President, on a point of order, Senator Walcott is misleading this chamber. I am making reference to what he spoke about. The main fact, and I'm going to Appendix C, page 13, for the interest of this Honorable Senate, item number 8, and let me explain to the Senate if they don't understand what is in these estimates. And it says here, Commonwealth Construction on page 11. Commonwealth Construction Canadian Limited, Correction Court Prison Project, 288, the value of the loans raised, $288,602,650, and the outstanding amount, $244,361,319. See Note 8. You go to Note 8 on page 13. It says
Madam President,
Hold on.
This is a point of order. I thought it was a point of elucidation. I didn't know what a point of order. They're interchangeable. I didn't know they were interchangeable.
Senator Walcott.
Madam President.
Order, please.
Well, I don't know when
Order,
it's
please.
It's simple.
Senator Walcott, Senator Ince was querying a statement you made, and he's using his evidence to indicate why he's objecting.
Madam President, the senator stated clearly. Yes, ma'am. That this loan is a bullet loan. That at the end of these payments, when I queried that 30 million, he said that this he compared it to the Japanese loan that was borrowed, and it is a bullet loan. And I said, to assume that this is a bullet loan in the absence of an interest rate, it is scandalous to come to this Senate at this time and state that this loan for the prison, when we heard all the time that it was borrowed to build the prison, all of a sudden you are hearing that this is a bullet loan. We need to investigate this. Madam President, thank you.
Madam President, I said it was the bullet payment at the end. That's all I said. But I'm not going to tarry on that. I'm not going to tarry on that specific one. The point is that there is a Credit Suisse loan for $450 million that has to be repaid in 5 years. The concern is that our foreign reserves are down to 410 million. That is a concern. But I'm also concerned not only about loans. Not only about loans, I'm concerned about arrears, Madam President, that are not shown in these estimates. I am concerned about the arrears to University of West Indies. I'm concerned about the loans and the arrears to the NIS, to Ionics. I'm concerned about the loans to SBRC. And indeed, I'm concerned more so about the arrears to UCAL. To UCAL. Madam President, the Honorable President knows why I would be concerned. And I'm told that these arrears could be as much as $700 million. Those are the things that I think we also need to be concerned about in terms of this government debt. And at a time when the Minister of Finance is speaking about seeking to get an urgent loan of $200 million to prop up our foreign reserves position. That is what I'm concerned about. And that is what Barbadians are concerned about in terms of loan. Recognizing the importance of these over 20 downgrades. I believe last year the Honorable Member wanted to argue if it was 19 or 19 and a half downgrades that the country had undergone. We are concerned, the country, about a Prime Minister who tries to dismiss the whole issue of downgrades to junk as nothing, and speaking to his faithful supporters about can't downgrade Barbados, but seemingly to miss the significance in terms of your credit rating, as it has to do with foreign direct investment and capital inflows, and most importantly, at a time when you say you're looking for a $200 million loan to urgently prop up your foreign reserves, that you would be concerned about the downgrades. Madam President, the bottom line, sustainable plan, recovery plan, medium-term, this manifesto, is that this government has acted too late and has made some bad policy decisions. And they've been focusing on taxation and expenditure cuts. And they are not prepared to admit that they've made errors. There's no real growth strategy. And even one of their own, a member of the cabinet, has said so openly that it's a wrong policy. And they said he did not support it, and even brandished his own policy, which I have no doubt was discussed and dismissed. But that is the problem. Contrary to all of the advice that has been given to this government, their extreme arrogance does not allow them to admit a single fault. They can't admit that errors have been made. And of course, as a result of these errors and this arrogance, the whole country has to suffer because of these errors and this feeling that you know it all, not you, Madam President, the government. The Minister of Finance has come with plan after plan after plan. People of Barbados have been making the sacrifices, and the pain continues. And now we have a plan which, and when you read fine print, more sacrifices, more pain, yet they're telling you no IMF. So we need to know what is really behind this. Printing of money by the central bank, pleased to say that it has diminished substantially. It's gone from over 700 million to, I believe, it's 90-something million. But that is still a problem. The national insurance still remains, from time to time, the ATM machine for government. I'm watching it. We've seen the actual reports, their concerns raised. But the concern really has to do with the pensioners, who are concerned in terms of the security of their national insurance pensions when persons who are working and approaching the age become worried if it will be available to them. In spite of all of this, lending to government, because in many cases they've used it for their retirement, to pay tuition fees for their grandchildren, which was free before, and indeed, in terms of their healthcare costs, which have been spiraling. Madam President, and over the years, advice has been offered. I said so just now. Former PM Arthur, I believe he offered advice. There was even thought. Madam President, the honourable members on the other side understand how that I'm not feeling 100% this evening. PM Arthur, Owen Arthur, you know what I said? PM Owen Arthur, Madam President, has advised them in terms of, I believe there was even talk of him working assiduously, I think that is a good word to use there, to improve the state of the affairs in terms of managing the economy. 3 former central bank governors, other reputable economists, local and overseas. I know some of them local, the government doesn't like to hear. But indeed, in the cabinet, they have their own economists of sorts. But what really, Madam President, will a government that is notoriously slow on implementation not achieve in 1, 2, or 3 months? Whether they like it or not, that is the possible lifespan of this government. How will fiscal stability be obtained? How will the deficit be further reduced? And if you couldn't do it in 10 years, Madam President, they're not going to do it in 3 months. I wonder if behind the rush to get these estimates laid in February, how they will go about expenditure reduction. I'm wondering, or will these estimates be used for some pre-election splurge? I don't know. I am wondering. How will they go about this expenditure reduction so that it is rational, so that it is targeted, so that it is strategic, but not political a few weeks from the election, Madam President? I'm wondering. I'm really wondering. And I thought that the honourable member would have told us a bit about the BNTCL, the sale of BNTCL, which is so urgently needed in terms of the funds, in terms of support. And the more recent one that was raised in this honourable chamber, the sale of the Hilton, or has that been put on the back burner, pending the request of the minister for it to be assessed in terms of its value. Cabinet haven't already agreed to its sale in October for a specific value, specific cost. I'm just wondering. I mentioned earlier the use of the IMF SDRs, and I would expect that I would have an answer from the government side in terms of if they've used the SDRs from the IMF to help store up this declining foreign reserve situation. But all in all, the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan looks somewhat, if you've been familiar with Grenada and Jamaica, looks so much like the plan that they use in terms of discussions with the IMF. And I'm here wondering if this document, Madam President, is a prelude to the government of Barbados going to the IMF for that institutional, to have access to that institution's flexible credit line. I wonder. It has an amazing resemblance in terms of the Grenada document that was used, and similarly to some aspects of the Jamaican document. And it really, it behoves the government to tell us if they have in fact started negotiations and discussions with the IMF, and that if this document will form part of the basis for those discussions. Those are the things that we need to hear, not delusional ideas about people not sharing the losing, running, and all sorts of things, and booing from the sidelines. Those are the things that you expect to hear in an appropriation debate. Madam President, they are the general issues, and as I said, I'm not going to go after dissecting the estimates today. I'm not in that mood, that frame of mind. But there's some issues I need some clarification on. The first one that comes to mind as I peruse the estimates was the HIV/AIDS prevention and control sub-program within the Ministry of Health. And I think all honorable senators will be aware of the tremendous importance of that program for Barbados. And when I looked at page 114 of the estimates, Ministry of Health, Head 23, Sub-Program 397, Treatment. I see supplies and materials going from 6.5 million, down to 3.1 million. And I'm concerned. HIV, prevention and control, treatment. And I believe Honorable Senator Jacobs should be concerned too, bearing in mind the tremendous work and the achievements in terms of the control of HIV/AIDS in Barbados. And certainly Barbados was a leader in the region. So I'm concerned. It says supplies and materials. It speaks to treatment. I don't want to believe that in these estimates, the provision for treatment for patients with antiretrovirals has been slashed from 6 million to 3 million. That is one that stuck out at me in terms of these estimates. The QH, of course, has been provided in the estimates with $149 million. And I believe it was agreed long ago by the same government that in truth and in fact they need between $185 to $190 million per year. Clearly, I can only assume that there's a plan to have supplementaries at the appropriate time. I'm concerned about the drug service. I mentioned it earlier. The government can see that there's savings, but I'm still concerned in terms of the stockouts at the public pharmacies, which come under the rubric of the Ministry of Health in terms of funding. With the increasing cost of everything, increasing cost of living, a number of persons who formerly went to private pharmacies now depend on the polyclinic pharmacies. Obviously, there's a greater need, and they're often stocked in terms of supplies. Sometimes patients have to go without very important antihypertensive and antidiabetic medication, and this is something that needs to be addressed. In terms of our environmental conditions, we know in all the difficulties in terms of the sewage, mosquito-borne illnesses, in terms of the bush, in terms of the indiscriminate dumping in gullies, there's always the expectation that we can have upsurges in vector-borne diseases, leptospirosis in terms of rats, and of course, dengue, chikungunya, which I believe has now been also attributed to the Barbados Labour Party by an honorable member of the other chamber. And of course, there's Zika. And these are issues, I think, in terms of that should be addressed, and in terms of the estimates, I'm not seeing the allocation in terms of vector control, and this is a little worrisome to me. Conditions in accident and emergency continue. I admitted that 4 years ago there was some improvement, but now the situation has gone back to probably what it was, or even worse in some cases. But there was an improvement, but now it has, I don't know, for whatever reason. The Lions Eye Care Center, 5 years ago, I believe Minister Ennis was the Minister of Health there. He spoke about this grand opening, this grand event, when persons were going to come from across the Eastern Caribbean to have surgery done there. That remains unopened in terms of eye surgery. Obviously, it needs to be, in terms of the assistance rendered by the EU, the Sandy Lane Trust, Rihanna, the Marie Holder Trust. These have all played very useful roles in terms of maintaining the hospital. And I believe that the chairman should, recognize them, and we should recognize the assistance that they pay. The St. John Body Clinic, I'm not going to say much about that this evening. There will be times to speak about the cost overruns and the background, how a polyclinic, which was supposed to provide health care at a certain level with x-rays and ambulances, has changed into something that provides health care, that provides hairdressing salon, that sells lotto tickets, all of these things. But that is something for another place and another time. But while I'm on the St. John Polyclinic, haven't spent all of this government funds on the polyclinic in terms of the original cost was estimated at 15 million. It reached close to 35 million, but there was going to be good governance and transparency. But after all of that, how is it that there's a dialysis facility there, and for ordinary Barbadians to have access to it, they're asked to pay? I am asking, how is that possible? The ambulance service, again, that is, I see that there's provision made. I assume there's an increase of $211,000 in the estimates. I assume that is to purchase a new vehicle, and the government should be lauded for that. But then there's the issue of the decentralization. And while they were refurbishing the Arch Hall fire station, the ambulance that were based in the north, especially, for instance, Madam President, suppose you had gone to, and you're going to Moontown some evening, and through an act of faith, you develop a severe case of gastroenteritis, and you're going into shock. The ambulance would be there at the fire service. Madam President, I'm hearing an echoing from the microphone. I don't know if it is that, but I'm speaking about the ambulances that were deployed at the fire services, that were deployed down there.
They're still there?
Madam President, obviously the honorable members have had access to use the ambulances from there. I'm pleased to hear, Madam President. Madam President, in terms of the energy and the environment, there was a lot of discussion and positions taken. It was 2 years ago in the estimates in terms of some K-Hill project that was to be the redeemer for energy in Barbados. And I remember the honorable members on the other side, to a man and sometimes a woman, speaking in support, in vociferous and strident support of it. And I'm just wondering, I don't see any mention of it anywhere in the estimate. So I'm wondering if it has disappeared in terms of, there was no mention of it, certainly not by the person who presented on behalf of the government. But I believe rather than being focused on the trucks, they seem to be more concerned about building a five-story office building. And I think that is where it goes back to the mismanagement that I spoke to earlier, where your concerns seem not to be in providing sanitation supposed to collect garbage. not in terms of developing four-story buildings with air-conditioned offices and state-of-the-art furniture. They're supposed to collect garbage.
But that same thing that John is saying about national housing.
And some garbage too, that might be. And I come, Madam President, to the Ministry of Agriculture and Water Resources. I think this is a fantastic ministry. I would hope that they would have been doing some more substantial work in terms of crop diversification in Barbados, and that we would be in an enlightened position now, some 4 years later, in terms of the plan for the sugarcane, or if we're going to have River Tarman, which is going to festoon the countryside, and what purpose it was going to be used for. But alas, all I can hear about the $5 million that the Ansel McCall funding, and all I see when I drive into St. Joseph and I pass this supposedly, it was supposed to be an energy facility, I see just hoarding bills, and I see billboards and some stickers of dances sometimes, and I look right in front of UPP or something. A $500 million sugar factory that they spoke about. And we were going to have River Tarman all over Barbados. And the biomass was going to be used for energy generation. And this was part of our green energy. Madam President, I wonder what has happened. What has happened? What really has happened in terms of this process, this project? So KL was to deliver energy. A sugar factory was supposed to deliver energy. Now there's a man from Canada who's supposed to deliver more energy in the photovoltaic area in the botanical gardens. I mean, this is a government that is full of plans for energy, but can't seem to get a single project started in regards to this energy. And then they give us every time there's a meeting over here speaking about green energy and renewable energy. And not a single thing. The photovoltaic initiative has gone away because of lack of proposals and the funding and the assistance that was to be provided. But I guess all of this is like the honorable member, the minister of the other place, who is in charge of it, full of sound and fury and a lot of air when it comes to these projects. But there's something that amazes me too, in terms of the Barbados Water Authority, in terms of governance and transparency. New building, who does it go to? A contractor. Maintenance of the grounds contract, who does it go to? The same contractor. The changing of the meters, $25 million, happens to be which contractor? The sugar factory, which contractor? Which contractor? But I know it is all good governance and transparency. But I wouldn't like to believe that all of these things, Madam President, that I mentioned, in addition to some, the deploying of these water tanks, all of this is one contractor. Because I know the government believes in governance, good governance and transparency. So I know that no ministry would be allowed to put hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of contracts to one contractor. I know. So I know that that is impossible. And now we have two desalination plants. For a long time, the Barbados Labour Party was criticized for having an ionics plant at Spring Garden for several years, and they were told that it was not up to full capacity. Now we're not to have an additional reverse desal plant. We'd have two, one in the north and one knows where. And again, I wonder which contractor. These are the things that seem to boggle my mind. And then we go to tourism. And the arrival figures are looking good. Everybody is happy. But then there's this concern. I remember in 2014, when the arrival figures were not looking good, we were told in this honorable chamber that we're so concerned with arrival numbers, we should be concerned about tourist spend. Now I am saying that the arrival figures are looking good, very good. But the government needs to be concerned about this lack of spending by these tourists. I'm still waiting to hear an update on the Pier Head project and the cruise pier terminal project. These were supposed to be the bedrock of development and in terms of expanding the cruise ship industry in Barbados. $12 million was spent in consultant fees for the Sugar Point development at the harbor. Not a word. 3 years later, $12 million. I see that arrangements for flights to Panama, and I sincerely hope that the Ministry of Tourism be more successful with these tours to Panama than the frolic with Copa to Brazil, which occurred a couple of years ago. And there's still this story to be told, and there's a point, not in this chamber, Madam President, but in terms of a certain concert and who benefited here in terms of a certain concert. But that is not a matter for today, Madam President, not in here. We would not delay the Senate with that matter. So and then we go to the Ministry of Public Works. Yes, Madam President, I have the documents. The operating costs in terms of the ministry, in terms of the Transport Board. Again, there's a dire need for buses, and I see no reflection in these estimates that there is provision for that. It could be, I don't know. And I, like the Honorable Senator, my colleague, Trotman, a concern is what is meant to happen, what will become of UCAL, what is the future of UCAL vis-a-vis the Transport Board, and in regard to the millions of dollars owed to UCAL by the Transport Board. I gather that there was a Trinidadian consultant who was paid quite substantially, but who has now left the country, and we have not really seen the production in terms of having the buses on the road. Madam President, I said I was going to be brief. I think I spoke longer than I intended to when I got up. And suffice it to say that Madam President, the Barbados economy, we all appreciate, is in a very precarious place. The foreign reserves are less than half what they were in 2008, and as according to the central bank report, we are only able to cover approximately 6 weeks of imports. The national debt is twice what it was, and it continues to increase. Madam President, it is absolutely clear that poor policy choices and indecisiveness are responsible for where this country is today. Decisive action is certainly needed, but for what I read in terms of the endorsement of this document, this is not decisive. This is still a work to be completed. This is still in need of an implementation plan. This is still not what is needed at this point. Distractions, DLP alternative facts, denial and deception are not what is needed. Now, what is needed is action to deal with the economic crisis which this country faces at this point in time. And Madam President, if I may be permitted to modify the Roman historian Tacitus, who I believe is a favorite of members on that side, and certainly their leader, I will say to them, Madam President, you created a wilderness and called it progress.